Advisory Committee on Chemicals peer review meeting focused on the EPA TSCA Draft Systematic Review Protocol. I'm Dr. Todd Peterson, and as the designated federal official for this meeting, I serve as the liaison between the Science Advisory Committee on Chemicals and the agency. I'm also responsible for ensuring provisions of the Federal Advisory Committee Act, that's FACA, are met, and the SACC meetings are subject to all FACA requirements. These include open meetings, timely public notice of meetings, and document availability. The agenda for today shows that we have, I think, a lunch break and one other break today. But as I noted yesterday, the chair at his discretion may call for additional breaks during the meeting today. Adding a 10-minute break here or there can be helpful for the committee, and it only adds a little bit of extra time to our agenda. For members of the press, the EPA media relations staff are available to answer your questions about this meeting. Please address any questions to Kathy Milbourne, and her email address is milbourn.cathy@epa.gov. As noted in our announcements about this SACC meeting, the agenda times are approximate, and we will be starting today with charge question 3E as opposed to 3D, which is listed on the agenda for today. So we've advanced one charge question as of yesterday afternoon, so we're a little bit ahead of schedule, hopefully. So I will now turn the meeting over to the chair, Dr. Schlenk.
Thanks, Todd. Yeah, we had a fairly eventful day yesterday, going through questions 2 and 3, addressing the literature review, and I think a lot of recommendations were made specifically for that component of the protocol. Once we started getting to some of the weighting issues and more quantitative or versus qualitative assessments of quality, that's where we started to see some, I wouldn't say disagreements, but definitely some differences of opinion there. So I think that will be captured in the final minutes. Today we'll move forward. We'll finish up the quality of evidence component and then move into more general overview of question 4, which deals particularly with integrating the evidence and exposure and hazard. So with that, there were a couple questions that came out of some of the panelists, or sorry, some of the committee members for the EPA on some of the questions. So at this point, I think Dr. Rooney, you had a couple questions that you wanted to voice, and see if anybody else wants to join in on that before we get rolling.
I did. My first question is a recommendation, if they could share slides. That is that the organizational features of the document. A number of the committee members had mentioned challenges navigating the protocol, the TSCA document. And Todd, I don't know if you have the slide prepared to share. I was just going to quickly point out a feature that would recommend EPA use in the formatting of the PDFs.
Yes, can Andina bring up the slide set that I sent this morning? Will, please.
And that is, go through it really quickly, and I can start even before the slide starts. Just recommend that EPA use the bookmarks that are developed from table of contents and section headings. And just to be clear, okay, go ahead to the next slide. Great. And this is an example document. I apologize for the self-reference, but it's the only one I had on hand this morning. That when you develop a PDF, normally there are bookmarks that are developed with section heads and chapters that if you select where I've selected that arrow, next slide, the document, back one, the document would jump to that section heading. and it allows users to navigate back and forth. And if you go to the final slide, for some reason they're absent, or at least I couldn't find them on the TSCA document. So a simple recommendation that will aid in navigation. And that's it. I have an additional question and for EPA, and that is, apologize, as I was going through question 3F, I wasn't clear on what EPA was asking for. And if EPA could provide a little, clarity to that question, what guidance, what recommendations are they looking for, that would help in responding. I know this is late and we're going to head to that question in just a moment, but it would be very helpful if the EPA had any additional context they could provide on what specifically that question is trying to elicit.
Dr. Barone, are you on? So.
Yes, I am.
Yeah.
With regard to the PDF comments and the navigation pane, our intention was to have that working. And we definitely understand the committee's concerns and recommendations. I'm not sure why that isn't working in this PDF for some of you, but we will definitely pay closer attention to that. And the suggestion about hyperlinks and internal links, that is part of best practices in document production. With regard to the charge question, does the level of detail for the evaluation of data streams in the TSCA protocol provide appropriate transparency to readers and reviewers? There's a lot of text and tables provided about evidence integration. We're really asking for your input about the evidence integration process, both the systematic review aspects of that, as well as the evidence integration that takes place with non-systematic review information. So that's the context for the question. And hopefully that helps.
Stan, I know it's coming on the fly, but question 3 is for chapter 5, the quality of the evidence.
It is, and
it
leads to evidence integration. So we're asking, have we sufficiently provided enough detail from the quality, from the evidence tables, that from data evaluation to feed into the evidence integration? I jumped ahead, I'm sorry.
Okay, no, that's fine. So you're looking for recommendations on if there's additional information on collecting or on assessing quality or on setting it up for integration?
Setting it up for integration.
Setting it up.
In other words, we are generating data evaluation tables, extraction tables, which are discussed in chapter 5 and 6. Are there any suggestions about how to improve that, how to clarify that? Should we provide additional guidance? Sorry.
Okay. Thank you, Stan.
Yeah.
Dr. Barone.
Great, thanks. Okay, barring any further questions, does anybody have, before we read in the question, I'd like to take a quick roll call to make sure everybody's there. No other questions? Okay, so yeah, let's go ahead and take a quick roll call. We'll start off with the SACC committee members first. Dr. Apte?
Present.
Dr. Baker?
Here.
Dr. Blystone?
Here.
Dr. Cobb?
I'm here.
Dr. Chasen?
Present.
Dr. Davies?
Here.
Dr. Doucette?
Virtually here.
Dr. Heiger-Bernays?
Here.
Dr. Johnson?
Here.
Dr. Kissel?
Here.
Dr. Prisbilla? Dr. Prisbilla? Not hearing you. Okay. Dr. Reif?
Here.
Dr. Rollins?
Here.
Great. Dr. Voorhees?
Here.
Great. And now for our ad hoc reviewers, Dr. Barrow,
Here.
Dr. Poulin. I got it right.
Well, you broke up
Nope,
a little
just-
bit on my end, at least, but I'll say here. I assume you said
Thanks.
phonetic. Yeah.
I did. Thanks. Dr. Goyek,
I'm here.
Dr. Lamb,
Present.
Dr. Myers,
Here.
Dr. Pelch,
Here.
Dr. Rooney,
Here.
Dr. Wong,
Here.
Dr. Wyckoff,
Here.
and let's go back. Maybe I broke up when I was saying Dr. Prisbilla. No, Dr. Prisbilla. Okay. Great. All right. At this point, let's go ahead. Dr. Fay, if you could read the question into the record, that would be great.
Kelly Fay, US EPA. On charge question 3E, please comment on using data evaluation criteria from standardized test guidelines, e.g. OECD, OCSPP test guidelines, along with professional judgment to guide the evaluation of quality of non-standard study designs or analytical methods. Are there additional standardized/harmonized and well-vetted and recognized guidance/guidelines available to aid in evaluating adequacy or appropriateness of study designs or analytical methods?
Okay. Our lead discussant for that is Dr. Goyek.
All right. Good morning. This question highlights the historical difficulty in adopting a single system to assess study quality that can be used to assess both studies conducted according to standardized testing guidelines and according to non-standardized testing guidelines in a side-by-side, non-biased way. And very generally, there was a lot of agreement among the commenters. In the details, there are some distinct points to note, but generally lots of agreement. So across the board, the comments were supportive that standardized guideline studies and non-guideline studies should be considered with equal emphasis, and that EPA should not make an automatic assumption that guideline studies are of higher quality or higher confidence. This point is considered critical, actually, and recommended to be emphasized in the directions to the reviewers for evaluating quality ratings. There's also agreement among the peer reviewers that the inclusion of test guidelines, such as OECD, OCSPP test guidelines, is a clear, logical, and transparent step to rely on standardized guidance for the evaluation of methodological quality of any study design. And of course, this will always require professional judgment to guide the application to particular situations or write guidance for reviewers. Guideline studies are the global standard for tests designed specifically to evaluate chemical hazards. They're used for many regulatory purposes, including hazard classification under GHS, the globally harmonized system, for other regulatory purposes as well, such as pesticide active ingredient registrations, food additives and contaminants assessments, pharmaceutical drug product approvals, just to name a few. In areas where the field is more established or settled, the use of test guidelines from authoritative bodies such as OECD and OCSPP is a logical approach, as is a suggestion to use standardized and recognized guidance. For documentation, EPA should refer to the source of the guidance, either at the main document level, for example, this handbook or the overall protocol, or in the individual chemical-specific protocols that will be customized to the specific situation of exposure, fate, chemical properties, and outcomes assessed. And for areas where the methods and techniques are still emerging, the methodological guidance or recommendations from other sources should be considered. The same approach should be followed and presents a transparent approach to outlining methods. Reliance on guidance documents is likely to particularly inform the outcome assessment and data presentation and analysis domains, although other domains may be impacted for specific assays. It's considered that standardized test guidelines provide an opportunity to assess other aspects of internal validity, as well as aspects of construct and external validity, and thus should be considered in a formal capacity, even if it is separate from the specific quality metrics. Perhaps the standardized test guidelines could be considered in synthesis and integration. One reviewer noted that if a study is appropriately conducted according to the standardized guidelines, it's likely that the study would end up with a high quality rating. However, as another reviewer noted, although the guidelines are helpful to ensure that the relevant information for assessing the quality of studies is reported in a publication, it is important to note that complete reporting of a study methodology and results is not necessarily indicative of the quality of the underlying research. Limitations in reporting should not be interpreted as risk of bias or lower quality rating. This has been included in NASM recommendations to recognize that incomplete reporting raises challenges in interpreting study results, but that's not a marker of the validity of the study findings. It's important that EPA clearly distinguish between methodological quality versus study reporting concerns and incorporate these guideline considerations appropriately in the quality judgments. And another point to note, the protocol does not provide explicit clarity regarding how an assessor will use the standardized test guidelines in their evaluation of study quality. One reviewer offers a recommendation to improve this. In our practice, we have found it useful to use OECD guideline study design to help refine the risk of bias and validity criteria to be specific to an outcome. For example, if the outcome is developmental toxicity, DART guideline studies can help to guide the refinement of the outcome criteria for appraisal. Therefore, a recommendation is that the evaluation process formally integrate validity concepts from the test guidelines, rather than simply allowing this to be used at the discretion of the reviewers. And then overall, I think a recommendation is that the EPA should rely on guidance and guidelines to inform the assessment of study quality for any study design. Standardized and recognized guidance should be preferred, but in situations where they're not available or methods are too new to be widely accepted guidance, then other sources of guidance should be considered and cited. Where possible, the EPA should rely on consistent application of methods for other domains and metrics, rather than modifying in each and every case based on guidance. In other words, carefully consider if it is a necessary or significant advance to modify the approach for specific study designs or methods. And then there are also a few comments on the use of professional judgment in addition to the standardized testing guidelines. Generally, there was agreement among the reviewers that it's appropriate to that professional judgment be used to assess data quality in addition to the standardized test guidelines. Indeed, the combination of both professional judgment and in addition to the standardized test guidelines is considered a strength of the proposed systematic review protocol. In addition, the definition of specific domains and metrics by which both standardized and non-standardized study designs are assessed for quality seems an appropriate approach to compare both types of studies according to predefined objective criteria. And I have a reference to point out that was discussed in a previous question on 3B, but I think it's relevant here also to highlight it's kind of the utility or maybe the difficulties in doing these side-by-side assessments of both GLP studies and non-GLP studies. So Case et al. 2016 conducted a round-robin assessment. It's included 75 scientists that evaluated 8 studies that looked at, that used one of 2 different scoring approaches to assess those 8 studies. The 2 different scoring approaches used in this particular study was one approach that uses quite a simplistic categorization of data quality, the Klimisch method. And then the second method built on those original categories defined by Klimisch et al., but used more detailed criteria. The second scoring method is called CRED, the criteria for reporting and evaluating ecotoxicity data. And so a few highlights from the results. The tool with the less detailed criteria, the Klimisch scoring, did tend to favor guideline studies in this particular study. But the tool with the more detailed metrics that were presented in a bit of a checklist approach so that reviewers could, kind of led the reviewers through a greater level of detail, led to a greater identification of methodological issues with the GLP studies. For instance, issues with defining the test material identity. And so the conclusion was that this the use of these more detailed descriptive criteria improved consistency across the reviewers. And the reviewers themselves, when they were asked for their comments, identified that they felt that the method with the more detailed descriptive criteria was less reliant on expert judgment. And so, this reference is brought up as support for the current proposed systematic review protocol that uses the detailed metrics and domains that are judged individually as an important method to consider data quality of both guideline and non-guideline studies. And then one final consideration on how test guidelines are considered in this proposed systematic review protocol. The protocol should directly address the apparent disconnect with test order studies, which are often required to be conducted according to guidelines. This would suggest that even though the studies are guideline-based and reviewed by TSCA prior to their conduct, they may or may not be classified as high quality in the risk evaluation. On a related note, the protocol should directly address the concept of funding bias for studies conducted under test orders. Because these are required to be conducted, will they subsequently be dinged for funding bias, despite being guideline and most often conducted by a contract research organization? The protocol should specifically clarify when funding bias will be assessed. For example, if a stakeholder chooses versus if a stakeholder is required to conduct a test. And that ends the comments that were received on this question.
Okay, thank you. Our first, let me just point out Dr. Brisbois has joined us. She'll be next in line after Dr. Blystone. Any comments additionally for you?
Yeah, Dr. Goyak did a great job. I didn't specifically mention the test order question in my comments, but I just wanted to highlight that I would agree with that. I was confused that test orders and protocols that have been approved by EPA would somehow possibly not be matched as being appropriate for use or dropped out in systematic review. And I was confused by that. So I just want to highlight that as well. Thank you.
Okay, great. Dr. Brisbois.
Thank you, Dr. Goyak, for that great review. I'm going to refrain from turning on my camera in case I have more connectivity issues, but I have no further comments. Thank you.
Thanks. Dr. Voorhees.
Yeah, that was great. Now I have nothing to add.
Dr. Lamb.
Thank you, Dr. Goyak, for that wonderful summary. I have nothing to add either. Thank you.
And Dr. Rooney.
Agrees, well summarized and organized. Nothing to add.
Okay, other committee members. Okay, not hearing any. At this point, we'll go, Dr. Jason, you have something?
I thought that was, by the way, Dr. Goyak, a really excellent summation. Elsewhere, I think we'll be discussing some points for the exposure assessment aspects of this. And I just wanted to note here that exposure assessment studies, as sort of regarded by this document, really focus in on things like analytical, biomonitoring, monitoring, et cetera, for which there are indeed many standards for what a good study looks like internationally. However, much of the exposure assessment, where you're making estimations of exposure to humans or groups of populations, are really not constructed in from information that falls under this kind of category. You'll be looking at activity profiles, dietary, regional dietary, source of foods, things like that, which haven't matured or really don't easily fall into one of these kind of classifications, even for how the studies are constructed or designed, or how the data should be evaluated in terms of the types of statistics that are most appropriate. So that's a much more open question. That body of evidence is extremely important for making exposure assessments quantitatively, but just don't lend themselves to this type of scoring, if you will. And the document really, I couldn't find within the document any place where that discussion takes place. But anyhow, I've written that up and I think that's going to be discussed elsewhere. I just wanted to add that one point to Dr. Goyak's summary, which again, I'm very impressed. Thank you.
Dr. Barrow.
Thank you, Lisa Barrow. I just want to, that was a great summary and I have nothing to add really, but I just wanted to sort of clarify or ask for clarification about the term dinged for funding bias, because I mean, there's basically two ways to account for funding bias in evidence evaluation. And one is to make it part of the risk of bias tool, if it's a true risk of bias tool. So in the reference we mentioned the other day that had 62 tools for assessing observational data, 7 of them include a construct related to funding bias as part of their risk of bias. Those tools don't use a scoring. And so that's just one aspect that is considered. With all the other aspects, a low score on that would not kick out the study. Another way to deal with it is to just report it and make sure it's accessible to readers. And then a third way that's commonly used to account for funding bias is to do a sensitivity or subgroup analysis in a meta-analysis. And so by that, you analyze all of your studies together, and then you do a sensitivity analysis, for example, taking out the ones that are industry funded. And if your estimates do not change, that gives you high confidence in your result. If your estimate changes, then it lowers the confidence in your result because it's related to the funders of the study and not some other aspect. So ding is a complicated term, and I just wanted to clarify that those are the 3 common ways to account for funding bias. Thank you.
I think those are really good adds to provide some detail there. Thank you.
Yeah, I don't think we want to put ding in the glossary, right? So as a term. Okay, with that, let's, if there are any other comments from any other committee members. Okay, that go back to Dr. Owen. Any questions of clarification that you have for based on the comments that you've heard?
Not thus far. Good dialogue, good summary. Sounds actionable.
Fantastic. Okay, at this point then, let's go ahead and move forward with question F. Dr. Fay, you want to read that into the record?
Kelly Fay, charge question 3F. Does the level of detail for the evaluation of data streams in the TSCA protocol provide appropriate transparency to readers/reviewers? If not, provide recommendations for specific additions along with estimates of the time it would add to the evaluation of data streams.
Okay, once again, our lead discussant is Dr. Goya.
Oh, sorry, I lost my mute button or the unmute button. This is Katie Goyak. So in contrast to the previous question, there was a bit more divergence in the types of comments I received and the perspectives. So I'll cover more of a divergent range of perspectives here. So a number of people commented on the level of detail, as was referenced in the question. So we have a range of views here. So on one hand, one reviewer noted that too much detail might be provided, and that citing the concern that that could be burdensome for reviewers. So specifically, this reviewer commented, in the recent NASEM 2021 report reviewing the EPA TSCA's systematic review approach, it was noted that the risk of bias evaluation of studies using the TSCA evaluation tool was potentially severely burdensome for reviewers, particularly when reviewing a large number of studies. Thus, the concern is not that more details are necessary for the TSCA approach, but instead that the approach to evaluate data streams should be better streamlined with existing validated methods and modified to capture only the most critical elements for evaluation to minimize the time requirements for reviewers. The incorporation of a large number of metrics for the evaluation criteria appears to pose a significant burden for reviewers and raises questions of whether this large number is necessary, given that many other available risk of bias evaluation approaches include fewer domains for evaluation. Furthermore, with such an extensive coverage of these metrics raises concerns of whether these findings are being double counted and thus implicitly being weighted more or less heavily than other considerations. A few reviewers noted that the level of detail felt appropriate, noting that the level of detail can be considered valuable information to promote consistency in the valuation across different reviewers. And this might have the end result of fewer discrepancies between the reviewers and then potentially less overall time needed to resolve those discrepancies. Also, the level of detail provided is considered to provide lots of useful information features, such as the backward searches, which are a valuable addition to this process to check the validity of the main search. One question to consider: if it is discovered that the backward searches generated data missing by the main search, what actions will be taken to address such problems? And specifically in section 4.4.1 on page 54, screening so-called difficult studies, quote unquote, on the difficult studies, under phase 2, subpart 2B, it states that if the agency is able to obtain the data from such difficult studies, it says it will use the data if the study is deemed, quote unquote, essential. Does that mean the agency will set such a study aside if it is deemed non-essential? How is essentiality determined exactly? And then there are a number of areas which were highlighted that require additional detail. So the first of these, there are often examples given that reviewers would use to make an evaluation. When these examples are presented, it would be helpful to provide all the options that are introduced to avoid bias and increase clarity. The second area, whereas discipline is defined clearly as 6 prescribed technical areas, so physical and chemical properties, environmental fate, exposure, engineering, human health hazard, and environmental hazard, it is not entirely clear how quote unquote data streams are used by TSCA. The definition on page 139 for data streams is the body of discipline-specific information derived or relevant to a specific topic area. However, across the document, data streams lacks the clarity of discipline. For example, on page 25 and 26 cites fate, transport, exposure, environmental and workplace monitoring, and engineering as the list of data streams. Later in the document, gray literature is used as another data stream. And this term is also cited in the chapter 7 integration. For example, integrate different data streams. A recommendation on this point is to suggest that the EPA include a specific list of data streams in the definition. Understanding that there may need to be a new or unique data stream in the future, the EPA could add others as needed for a particular evaluation to the list of data streams. And then a couple of specific pages highlighted that do require more detail. So on page 527, where is the stated evidence coming from? Does that mean literature or from the people producing the report? What kind of evidence and how much would satisfy this criteria? Page 529, an example of acceptable detectable values is given, but I think the reviewer needs clear-cut guidelines. Page 647, in general, when presenting criteria, quote unquote, e.g. should be avoided and a list of actual criteria be given. Perhaps this could be found in another document or a pop-out screen, but for consistency, reviewers need to know. And page 662, sufficient percentages should be defined. All right, so I received comments from a few other reviewers that rather than focusing on the level of detail part of the question, they really highlighted potential improvements in terms of transparency and clarity. So specifically, it would be most critical to have transparency in conducting the systematic review so that external parties are able to understand the process by which evidence was evaluated and decisions were ultimately made. Transparency is not as critical in the process, in the protocol itself, as much as clarity in the directions and the workflow, so that the reviewers and also external parties understand how the systematic review protocol methodology is applied to review and evaluate evidence, which are ultimately utilized to inform decisions and input for the risk evaluation. The multiple reviewers noted that there are aspects of the process where the justification for the approach is unclear or lacking. Specifically, a level of clarity, or specifically a lack of clarity in how the data quality rankings are used for exposure and hazard character classifications during integration, and then perhaps differently in subsequent risk evaluation steps following integration. For instance, some metrics in the quality evaluation are presented with only dichotomous ratings possible, specifically high, low only, or medium, low only. And it is unclear why that particular domain for that particular data stream is evaluated in this way, whereas others are not. This appears to be somewhat arbitrary, and no explanation is given for why only dichotomous options are available, or why the ranking of high is sometimes available and other times not. Text in the protocol appears to indicate that this is intentional, but the reason behind this did not make much sense. For example, that the high ranking was removed because too many reviewers were ranking studies as high and skewing results. This introduces a level of bias in the rating of studies and appears to be arbitrary and not scientifically defensible. A second comment. It is of note that none of the sub-questions regarding Chapter 5, methods used to assess quality, sought to address the metrics themselves. That is, SACC questions were aimed at the approach for how the metrics are used, ranking, etc. But no questions allowed for comment or discussion of the specific metrics themselves, or the criteria used to determine ranking within the specific metrics. That is, no charge question allowed for direct comment on, have we asked the right questions, or the most important questions, or the questions and metrics clear, etc. So as an example, in Appendix R, data quality for epidemiological criteria, Domain 2, Metric 4, measurement of exposure. To achieve a high ranking, 1, numerically 1, the requirement to have a measured versus estimated exposure is not entirely clear. For occupational populations, the description addresses parameters which describe frequency and duration via employment records and job matrix, but there is no mention of the concentration or dose term that would be needed to assess individual exposure. That is, do there need to be some measurements of the chemical for use in the matrix to be given a high ranking for exposure, or is an estimate of individual exposure from a model or similar also acceptable? This is an important distinction given the potential use of these studies in dose response assessment, as well as being able to characterize uncertainty or variability in hazard classifications. A recommendation on this point for clarity. It would be helpful to more clearly state if an individual exposure measurement, that is empirical data related to exposure, is required for this metric, as is done in OHAT, in order to achieve a ranking of high. So I think these few comments are just, they're highlighting places where there's really clarity needed in the process itself, in the criteria. And there are a few citations provided that might help this topic. So I have the full citations, but I'll just cite them to have them in the record. Burns and LeKind, 2021, Critical Reviews in Toxicology. LeKind et al., 2020, International Journal of Environmental Research and Public Health. Shore et al., 1992, Regulatory Tox and Pharmacology. And Stainer et al., 1999, Annals of the New York Academy of Science, I think is that abbreviation. I didn't double check that before I started. And then finally, one editorial comment on page 124, the Transparency and Documentation section refers to the crosswalk and references Appendix A, but that is circular because page 144 is in Appendix A. So just some clarification of editorial comment on that point. And that's the whole of the comments that I've got.
Great, thank you. Our first associate's Dr. Brisbilla.
Thank you for that great review. No further comment.
Dr. Voorhees.
Yeah, no further comment.
Great. Dr. Lamb. Dr. Lamb.
Yes, sorry. Thank you for that summary. I have no further comments.
Okay. And Dr. Rooney.
Again, excellent summary and no comments to add.
Okay, other committee members want to weigh in on 3F? Dr. Cobb.
Just a real quick comment based on the very nice presentation there. The exposure assessments or the chemical concentrations in various media may pose a conundrum, because if I remember correctly from past SACC meetings, the folks doing occupational exposure very much thought that modeling data could be superior to measured data. And the folks like myself doing environmental measurements thought that the reverse might be true. And I don't know if others want to comment on that, but that could pose kind of a dichotomy in the way that these things are assessed for occupational exposures versus environmental or other kinds of exposures. And that's all.
Okay. You generated some discussion there, George. Dr. Barrow.
Thank you. Sorry, I had a different point. Although this that excellent summary accurately noted that the data stream wasn't defined consistently throughout the document, and I totally agree with that. But it also said that discipline was, and I just want to make sure we have on the record that discipline is also not consistently defined. So in table 3.1, there are 5 disciplines listed. There are 10 disciplines related to data evaluation listed in the appendices, and then the glossary has 6. Sorry, the first table had 5. I'm sorry. Anyway, my point is that it's not consistent throughout the document. So I think we need to have a parallel recommendation that discipline should be defined and used consistently throughout the document. And this has very important implications for the data evaluation, because I think, as we noted before, it's a little confusing to know what the unit of analysis always is for the data evaluation in terms of, is it a study, is it a discipline, is it part of a study, the outcome. So it is important to clarify that. So that's the recommendation, to clarify discipline throughout the document. Thank you.
Thank you. Dr. Chasen?
Thank you. This is Chris Chasen. Once again, Dr. Goyak, an excellent summation. And I think following on the issue Dr. Cobb just brought up, which is really critically important, and also the discussions by Dr. Barrow, the discipline and the subdisciplines, if you will, are really going to drive how best to use the data that are found. And once again, occupational exposure and measurements of concentrations in occupational settings, monitoring, biomonitoring, things like that, fall into a much more developed science realm and discipline. And I think most scientists understand how to use those data, and there are many guidances for how those kinds of data are to be created. That leads to sort of a scientific attitude that the data will be possibly more reliable or useful. I'd rather use the term useful than maybe modeling would suggest. However, as Dr. Cobb mentioned, for other kinds of very necessary exposure assessments, such as non-dietary activity and dietary contributions to exposure, it is not practical or even possible to test all of the residue levels that could be introduced from a contamination. That's certainly not even true in something as controlled as pesticide regulation. Hence, models are formed to create the answers, if you will, as a distribution of possible answers. The construct of such things are the product of many, many different kinds of studies. And each study or each piece of information, you wouldn't even necessarily call it a study, can contribute very significantly to the answers. And in those situations, it is often the case that the modeled answers, if you will, can be more prescient than any given set of residue data. Now, what are the factors that go into those kinds of models? Here is where I think the evaluation that is sought by this document could be more appropriate if, instead of saying a piece of information or a study is summarized as essential or not essential, I don't think those terms are relevant. It's more relevant to say whether or not a given piece of information is useful in the overall construct toward the exposure answer. And here's where the kind of guidance that Dr. Goyak talked about, where you might have a checklist that could be developed so that instead of saying, and by the way, the other thing I wanted to mention is some of the most important pieces of information for that kind of construct will not be chemical specific. So you will, you risk throwing out some of the most critical information by simply not gathering it, or it won't fall. It will be somehow culled out because I don't think it will be particularly obvious to unless somebody happens to be reviewing the information who is an expert in modeling for exposure assessment. They won't really intuitively, I think, understand how some of these pieces fit together in the algorithm. So this begs for the kind of constructive guidance that Dr. Goyak talked about in the study. So thank you.
Okay. Thanks for your comments. Anyone else for 3F? Okay, let's go ahead and move to Dr. Barone. Any questions or clarification regarding the comments?
No, no clarifications, except we really would like to have those references. Again, with the comments, the prior comments, all of these comments are very helpful to us, but having the references attached to the comments is extremely helpful and makes it more actionable when we go to read and revise based upon the recommendations. I did want to also respond to Dr. Rooney's earlier comments about the hyperlinking and the navigation pane of the PDF. We've been testing the PDF offline. It's working for us. But if you open the PDF in Adobe Reader, you're not going to get the navigation pane. You're not going to get the bookmarks. And also remind folks, the public included, that you need to download the document and bring it up in Adobe Acrobat. If you look at it in your browser, you also will not get the navigation pane. You will not get the bookmarks. We'll probably have future discussions in the administrative meeting about what versions of Adobe different folks are using and if there's any incompatibilities. But we want to definitely take advantage, because we put a lot of effort into bookmarking and hyperlinking this document and other documents because they are large and there are a lot of interrelationships within the document. So we were somewhat alarmed when we heard that this was a problem. We're trying to make this as readable and useful for ourselves, but for others.
That's great, Stan.
Hello? Was that you, Dr. Rooney?
Yeah, I just said that's great. I'm more concerned for the public than for us.
Yeah, just state your name before you speak. That'd be great, just for the record. Yeah. Dr. Myers?
I would just say on that comment that, very few people actually have Acrobat Pro, and that Reader is probably what you should be referring to because that's actually the free application. And it's also good for accessibility as well for people that have used screen readers and such, that they can go through those steps. So making sure that it's compatible with Reader, I think, would be the most important.
Okay. Dr. Rooney? No?
Yeah, I'm trying to re-download it because I have Adobe Acrobat and it's not working for me. Maybe it's just what we have in the folders for the SACC committee is not the right version. Not sure.
Actually, I'm looking at mine and I don't see the tabs on it, at least on my version. And I'm using Reader, but okay. Any other comments before we? I think what we'll do is, if there are no other comments, let's take a quick 10-minute break. We're doing well. We're ahead of schedule, which is nice. And let's go ahead and meet back at the top of the hour. Okay, welcome back, everybody. I have top of the hour. Looks like Dr. Myers, you have a question before we get rolling?
I just wanted to add one thing to the navigation part. So for those of us who still like to have the paper copy, I would always have a hard time figuring out what section I was in. So not only having the online accessibility is important, but also possibly putting section numbers, chapters like on the pages. So when you're going through 80 pages of tables, you can actually figure out where you are. That's just a suggestion.
Okay. Thanks. I assume we'll get that into the right section. Dr. Goyak?
Hi, this is Dr. Goyak. Yeah, I just wanted to add one clarifying point. I'm afraid in my reading of the comments for 3F, I didn't emphasize maybe the right part on the point about the exposure criteria and the example that we gave. Maybe there's some misclarity there. I think what I missed emphasizing was that we didn't spend much time as a committee looking at the specific criteria, and maybe maybe had we focused on, if the questions had focused on that part a bit, there might be more commentary, there might be more opportunity to provide clarity. But as it is now, it's I think we didn't really focus on that as part of the questions per se. I think that was the point of the comments, and I'm not sure that I said that, so I just wanted to clarify for everyone.
No worries. Thanks for getting that on.
Sure.
Okay. Let's go ahead and move forward to question 4. Dr. Fay, could you read that into the?
Yeah, this one's a long one.
It is a long one.
Kelly Fay, US EPA. On charge question 4, approaches for integrating evidence and exposure and hazard, chapter 7. Within the TSCA context, the weight of the scientific evidence is defined as a systematic review method applied in a manner suited to the nature of the evidence or decision that uses a pre-established protocol to comprehensively, objectively, transparently, and consistently identify and evaluate each stream of evidence, including strengths, limitations, and relevance of each study, and to integrate evidence as necessary and appropriate based upon strengths, limitations, and relevance. 40 CFR 702.33. An evidence integration approach was not described in detail in the application of systematic review and TSCA risk evaluations from 2018. And the NASM found that the evidence integration approach included in EPA's 10 previous risk evaluations is unclear. In the TSCA protocol, EPA has clarified that the evidence integration, which includes weight of the scientific evidence analysis, is a discrete step within the process of a TSCA risk evaluation, see figure 3.1, and uses data/information that have been subject to the TSCA protocol and data/information that may be derived or obtained from non-systematic review approaches, e.g. modeling, read across for generic scenarios, and analog approaches. Based on the TSCA SR protocol materials, see Chapter 7, and presentations provided to the committee, please address the following questions. Next slide, please. Please comment on clarity, transparency, and scientific defensibility of the TSCA protocol methods for integrating data within disciplines, e.g. PChem, environmental fate, environmental release and engineering, exposure, and hazard evidence.
Actually, Dr. Johnson, do you want to handle these separately or together?
Separately, please.
Okay, let's go ahead and start then.
Okay, thank you. I received comments on 4A from Drs. Wang, Barrow, Goyak, Cobb, Wyckoff, Hager-Bernays, and Apte. What I've done is paraphrased, in many cases, their comments, and ones that have already been presented may not be presented here. So I will ask my colleagues after you go down a horn later to please speak up if there's anything I missed. I think several of them has mentioned it's important for us to recognize that this is a very challenging task that the EPA is undertaken. This is not IRIS. Here, where IRIS is fairly focused on hazards to the general population, TSCA has not only that, but also has fate and transport exposure, toxicity, occupational health, ecotox. And so it's a wide range of charges that they have. So we recognize that. You have our empathy. In some cases, I think you have our sympathy as well. And so to start off, we recognize that this is a very challenging task and that the protocol does represent, however, some confusion in many areas, and many of these comments have already been mentioned before. As written, one committee member mentioned that it presents a convoluted, inefficient method for integrating data within the 6 disciplines. And so they may need to be separated to some degree, and the criteria used for each discipline may need to vary. The EPA did not follow the recommendation of the National Academy to separate evidence synthesis from evidence integration. To quote the National Academy, evidence synthesis deals with more homogeneous data within a single stream, and evidence integration deals with more heterogeneous data from multiple data streams. One recommendation is EPA could improve the clarity and transparency and efficiency of this process by adopting the Academy's recommendations to use synthesis for drawing conclusions separately from each evidence stream, that is from human, animal, mechanistic evidence. And we have some other examples, graphical evidence we could show you, or tablature evidence we can share as well. And to use integration for drawing conclusions considering all evidence streams in combination. EPA should also clarify considerations that are applied conducting written stream evidence synthesis, applying a consistent set of considerations throughout the process. This would include clarifying the role and handling of mechanistic evidence and evidence integration. We also recognize there's a difference in evidence that's useful for determination of hazard, toxicity, and data that would be useful to develop a point of departure or dose response information. Former is used to determine whether a toxic endpoint is relevant during the hazard identification stage, and the latter is used to develop a safe threshold or point of departure if a sufficient body of evidence is suggestive for a specific adverse effect. It is recommended that this distinction be made because it's necessary in this linear approach. In other words, you do not need to develop a pod for a toxic endpoint with the insufficient level of evidence. For human health, it's suggested that the evidence tables first present whether sufficient or insufficient evidence exists for each toxic endpoint, for each of the lines of evidence, human, animal, mechanistic, to include a column to summarize what evidence supports that conclusion. Another table is needed that merges the overall evidence across each of the evidence streams, putting it all together to make a final determination if sufficient evidence exists for a hazard for each toxic endpoint. From there, derivations of the pods could be derived if data are available to do so for each toxic endpoint where the overall evidence of hazard is sufficient. And so we have 2 examples we like to show. Dr. Peterson, could you show the first one? There we go. Here's just an example where each of the toxic endpoints listed in the first column. And in this case, it was determined that human evidence was sufficient for neurological effect for exposure to this compound. Animal evidence was sufficient. The mechanistic evidence was suggestive. That's a different term than you see used for human and animal. And then there's comments on the very far column that help support those determinations. Can you next slide, please? Here, in this next table, all those lines of evidence are combined between human, animal, and mechanistic, and an overall determination is made, and comments or justifications are provided for that justification, sufficient or insufficient. Okay, now I'd like to go to the next presentation. And I will hand it over to Dr. Wang so she can present that example.
So this is Amy Wang. I have some suggestions on additional simplified table for currently table 7-14, I think. Could we have the slide, please? Dr. Burond presented a summary table, which I found very useful. There was some inconsistency with my interpretation of the current draft.
Are we waiting for the slide to be loaded? Is that?
I think so.
I don't have another slide deck.
I know, this is Todd Peterson, DFO. Did you send me a slide?
Yes, sir. It was sent this morning.
Oh, from you, Dr. Johnson?
Me, from Amy Wang.
Yes.
I'm looking at my email. I don't see it.
I think it's just past midnight, so made it today.
Amy, would you like to share your screen? Do you have it available?
We could do that.
Okay.
Yeah, why don't you share your screen? I think that's easier.
I would need permission to share the screen.
Yes. Okay, you should be good to go.
You're good.
Okay, we can see it, Amy.
Okay. So this is, sorry, let's go back one slide. This is what we saw on the first day of the meeting. And I found the yellow highlighted part, it seems to be inconsistent with the current draft protocol. And so I would suggest adding robust for both animal evidence and mechanistic evidence to make the final judgment of evidence demonstrates. Similarly, there's for this yellow highlighted part, it's actually slightly better for mechanistic evidence to be consistent with the draft protocol of making it into the evidence indicates. So I also have some additional suggestions that is different from the draft protocol. For the evidence indicates likely, currently it's when it's human evidence is moderate, animal evidence is robust. There's no specific requirement for the mechanistic information. However, to make sure that animal evidence can relate and the biological plausibility that what we saw in animals could happen in humans, I would recommend adding some mechanistic information requirements, such as moderate here. So it's a little bit lower than the robust, just one line above, but still indicates it's not automatically assume all things seen in animals will be relevant for human. And then here, I would also suggest adding when it's mechanistic information is only slight, with the animal robust being animal evidence being robust, that could feed into the next level of the overall evidence judgment, that will be evidence suggests. In this case, the human evidence does not need to be as strong as the category above. So indeterminate or better will probably do. So similarly, for the overall evidence of being indicated likely, the two scenarios that have either the animal evidence being indeterminate or slight, or human evidence being indeterminate or slight, but not both of them, the mechanistic information could be required to be robust to make sure that the connection is strong enough to make the second category of the overall evidence judgment. And at the very bottom, the yellow highlighted part is a minor suggestion, although the protocol does specify it's not showing all of the cases. I think adding the word or better in this line will make it clear and more consistent with the other places. So this is a summary of all the suggested changes for your reference. And the table has been provided. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Wang. Yeah, so basically we have one example of what such a table could look like. For your
This is
consideration.
Dr. Johnson. Dr. Johnson's now.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Dr. Schlenk. This is Dr. Johnson. And also we have an example of how maybe the tables could be better qualified from Dr. Wang. We'll provide both of those. Now, we have to recognize, or I think we do recognize, that not all in vitro information, a lot of it, in fact, is not useful mechanistic information. In vitro, new approach methods would fit in here, could be used for in vivo to in vivo to in vivo extrapolation, IVIVE, can be discussed in these tables. And that would be also useful when compared to draft OELs later in the pod derivation stages if sufficient evidence exists. I think this comment was made before, but I'll make it again. NAMs should be clearly defined so we know what we're talking about. Are these data from cells treated with chemicals versus organoids, next generation sequencing data? Are these all considered NAMs? How these data could be used could be very qualitative, or it could be quantitative. And how you may want to describe how this information could be used to support a body of evidence for hazard ID, or again, could be useful for developing toxicity-based benchmarks or pods. It wasn't sufficiently clear how such evidence would be evaluated for each domain for ecotox, fate and transport, PChem, and human health, as the PICO statements would likely be very different for each, and each data stream would be different. Suggest having parallel tabular examples of data evaluations in the document. On page 85, the first paragraph wasn't clear regarding fate endpoints from the published literature were included or excluded from consideration or from study quality evaluation. Table 7.1 suggests hierarchy, or we suggest hierarchy of quality for PChem parameters, but it should also include empirically derived calculations, which are somewhere in between experimental and QSAR or in silico projections. There was also confusion regarding the term environmental data, such as table 7.8 and elsewhere, where it pertains to human exposure effects or ecotoxicology hazard. Humans are indeed affected by environmental exposures. The entire discipline of environmental health is human focused. So suggest in this context, using the word ecotoxicity to refer to environmental, which is what is being discussed. Further, the populational relevance of mortality, growth, and reproduction is hypothetical. Mortality may not be important to populations that are supported primarily by immigration. Growth is not important when resources are limiting and being small facilitates reproduction. And reproduction may be only important when such decrements occur that exceed that which happens from regular ecological processes like baseline infanticide and predatory pressures. Since for any assessment populations, we do not know which factors are most relevant from a populational perspective, suggest a precautionary approach where any adverse apical effect is considered relevant, especially since in the TSCA case, the EPA may be redefining the definition of assessment population It may actually include the entire population of potentially interbreeding individuals, not simply a meta or assessment population. Table 7, 12, and 14 for consistency and further corroboration suggests integration of these different lines of evidence to include read across, in vitro, and modeling approaches, and to support findings of consistency. Also recommended the table contain a final determination where evidence exists first separately for each line, which we presented earlier, to include potentially in silico evidence as well. One commenter suggested that including only apical adverse effects in the PICO statement could be missing toxic endpoints of potential importance, since the available literature can be daunting in this area. One reviewer suggests that the EPA do a focused, phased approach to searching the mechanistic and NAM information. To those searches specific to the relevant toxic endpoints already defined as relevant where sufficient evidence exists. This could be initiated after the hazard assessment is done. It's also recommended that explicit recommendations for the evaluation of negative data be described. I believe they should be qualified and treated as equivalent as any other data. I have a comment that inconsistencies across evidence tables makes interpretation difficult. I have some very specific examples for table 7.7, 7.11, 7.12, and 7.14 and 7.15. I can go through each of those specific examples, but basically they're just looking for consistency across all those tables. So I think it probably fits better in a report than to be described right now. One committee member suggests that your clear information used outside the SR process is evaluated. This could be accomplished very qualitatively, and that's in regard to mechanistic information again. One commenter mentions that he finds several aspects of integration in the chapter quite helpful, as the hierarchies of data, overall documentation, integration is moving in a good direction. However, the chapter is very difficult to understand. It seems unnecessarily complicated with excessive use of complex and inconsistent terms, as well as lack of apparent coherency between disciplines. This clarity could be improved by structuring each section in a similar fashion using consistent terms, applying a clear description of the output of the integration with respect to the risk evaluation for each discipline. And for the latter, descriptions should clarify alignment with the conditions of use. There's also one mention of combined data techniques that is recommended for meta-analysis techniques, including meta-regressions, and where Bayes techniques are applied with data are amenable. Inclusion of non-systematic review data to fill data gaps or address questions is a defensible approach. However, the approach does not clearly describe the conditions under which the non-systematic review data are used other than to fill data gaps. Clarity is needed. Please be specific how mechanistic, in vitro, and silica could also be used. Mechanistic data could be used qualitatively to help corroborate animal and human inferences, where some in vitro data could be used in toxicology benchmark development. This is the third time I think I've seen this comment. It is not clear what is done with the evidence integration of physical chemical property evidence and information. And then page 70, sections 5.3, it was difficult to determine what was meant by the term metric in each study, each discipline. For example, animal, in vitro, epidemiological, or each toxic endpoint seems to be used generically throughout the document. Please define up front or consider providing a glossary. I think glossary is there. When regarding robustness, exposure science is relatively new and evolving. Finding relevant and useful data for exposure estimation that matches the temporal conditions of the toxicology benchmarks will be challenging. Exposures rarely occur evenly or consistently. Overall exposure in the SR protocol is considered mostly in terms of monitoring, biomonitoring, general population monitoring that may be a very small sliver of the exposure assessment literature and relevant key information. Many issues here, many which will be described later, detailed in writing, all which argue for the concepts of the EPA's reporting for study quality. It will be difficult and possibly do harm to the overall objective of getting to a scientifically credible exposure assessment. A few examples include data formats will not be as tidy as other disciplines for exposure assessment. Quantitative statistics are far less important than the relevance and completeness. Is full data included or only averages that don't show the peaks or normalized values versus normalized values? Importance of relevance of exposure to different population groups, life stages needs to be considered. Exposure differences due to seasonal and geographical variation, for example. Quality scoring of exposure studies will be difficult, and poorly graded studies may still contain information that's going to be useful. So the recommendation is not to use a study evaluation system for exposure information. Instead, to note how information will be used in the exposure and risk assessment. And overall classification could be whether or not the body of evidence provides enough information to make at least an initial estimation of exposure and to what populations that would affect or could be relevant, or whether the exposure information is inadequate to estimate exposure. A listing of application choices can be created so the studies can be linked to their utility in a structured pieces comprising exposure estimates. The body of information does not combine to permit a scientifically credible, complete exposure assessment. The implied data gaps can be listed. Just to provide a little additional information, the reviewer suggests activity profiles, dietary profiles, subsistence diets, all is important information that should be linked. Need for explicit inclusion of diet and activity, non-dietary exposures as well. This is a data gap if we don't have that information. Quality of data and pathways. Important to add metrics of data quality could include relevance to the exposed community, relevance to the PESS, completeness of the topic, to include diet, life activities, complete reporting of residue metrics. Variability and certainty are not good metrics. Variability is seen as a negative entry, could be actually evidence of multiple pathways or differences among target populations. It's not always a bad thing. Residue accumulations or many other important clues and emission patterns may be described by this variable information. Calling exposure information because of statistical characteristics that reflect variability and potentially uncertainty is risky and likely to call out important information. These criteria should be eliminated and placed with criteria such as representativeness, relevance to any human factor or exposure, or community-wide exposure, residue and multimedia emissions, patterns of human activity, diet, water intake, etc. Use of general population and overall limitation of exposure to consumers. Population and environmental exposure occurs throughout the documents. Opportunities to go farther beyond the general population of consumers exist. This term needs to be taken out of the document, substitute with much more inclusive descriptor. Include all states and territories, additional sources for table APX N5. There are other related issues throughout section N. Quality focused on geographical metrics, statistical metrics, far broader concepts are needed and will provide greater detail in the written report. And finally, again, another reviewer responds that IRIS and TSCA reviews are two different things. IRIS would typically neglect ecological receptors, which is important here in the TSCA context. And so it's important that these data and this review be conducted separately and not use the same methods as the IRIS assessments would. I think I've gotten to everyone's comments, so I'll stop here.
Okay, thanks, Dr. Johnson. Our first associate is Dr. Hager-Bernays.
Thank you, Dr. Johnson. I have no additional comments.
Okay, Dr. Barrow.
Thank you. That was a very difficult task to organize all of those diverse comments. And I maybe mine weren't clear on what I sent, but I did want to make a couple of sort of big picture comments about this section. And that is that, and again, I might sound a bit like a broken record, but the unit of analysis for the synthesis and the integration is not clear. So for example, in the tables that Dr. Johnson showed, we had organized them by endpoints or target organ systems. Typically with evidence integration methods, they're organized around the question that's being asked, the PICO question or the multiple PICO questions. And in some of the tables we have to review, the integration is actually organized around data stream. So it's not clear how it relates to the question. And I think this was brought up in the comments about, some of this data seems to be shoved into a systematic review format when perhaps that isn't even appropriate or necessary. And I think in a line with a previous comment, so a recommendation flowing from all that is that the EPA should have a figure or a table that shows the flow of data related to the PICO questions that are being synthesized within a data stream and then integrated across data streams. So I think a visual and description of that flow would be very useful. And my other point is that evidence integration typically includes all of the evaluated evidence and then rates the overall body of evidence for strength, variability, uncertainty, confidence, things like that. And for some of the disciplines that we were reviewing in terms of evidence integration, the criteria appear to introduce new criteria for data selection. So not just for evaluating the strength of the evidence. And I have some examples there related to the physical and chemical property information. And it says, you know, when several studies with equal rankings are available, 3 additional criteria can be used to select data: trusted source, measured data, estimated values. And these are problematic because some of the additional criteria overlap with criteria that were previously applied in the evidence evaluation section. And then some of them are actually related to the result of the study. For example, the estimated value rather than its validity or risk of bias. That's just one example. Like other committee members, I haven't gone through every criteria in detail, but the recommendation would be that at the evidence integration phase, all of the criteria should relate to assessing the strength of an overall body of evidence and not related to selecting data, which should come previously. And then my last, sorry, just one other specific comment on the criteria, because I think that will be useful for EPA. When looking at the epidemiological data, some of the criteria listed are typically used to rate strength of the evidence, like consistency, magnitude of effect, dose response. However, the document also lists risk of bias in table 7.10, and the study evaluation criteria in chapter 5 don't actually assess risk of bias. So I'm not sure where that, how that criteria is then moved into the study integration, the risk of bias, when it's not actually measured back in chapter 5 specifically. And as I think was noted earlier, but I really want to emphasize, I think that data stream needs to be defined and used consistently. In this chapter, there's reference to human, animal, and mechanistic data streams. And as Dr. Johnson pointed out, mechanistic data can be used for other things. And I think throughout this document, there's examples of when mechanistic data is treated as a stream, like in this chapter, but also in earlier chapters, and I have the details here, there's reference to it not being treated as a separate data stream, but being used for other purposes. So I think that needs to be clarified when EPA, a recommendation is that EPA should clarify when mechanistic data are treated as a data stream for synthesis and when they're used for other purposes. Thank you. That's it.
Okay, thanks for those comments. Dr. Goyak, I know you weren't around to hear the the general comments, but do you have anything to add besides what you already sent to Dr. Johnson?
No, nothing to add at this time. Thanks.
Sure. Dr. Wong, I know you made some comments. Do you have anything in addition besides what you already presented?
Yes, this is Amy Wong. I would like to emphasize something that Dr. Burrow just mentioned, is to look at the overall evidence to answer the question. So if we're putting a puzzle together, it's more important to have all of the pieces than having repeated piece that are very clear, but having missing pieces. Sometimes the piece might be a little bit fuzzy due to the age, damage, whatever, but they still provide information that other pieces are not providing. So where I'm going is that just because reference might not be ranked as high in terms of informative, they still have value if they are providing different information than the other studies that epidemiology call it triangulation, and in toxicology that may be overall weight of evidence. And I think I really agree with Dr. Barrow's point that it's the overall evidence that should be used to answer the question. Thank you.
Okay, Dr. Wyckoff.
Yes, thank you. Well, in keeping in trend with also kind of building and echoing what Dr. Barrow and also Dr. Wang had to say. First, thank you for the summary, Dr. Johnson. It was very nice. I know a complex topic, but one point that I wanted to emphasize, which I think comes a little less from the systematic review angle and more from the risk assessment angle, with respect to unit of analysis and answering the PICO, is putting all of that in context of the risk evaluation. And I think that there could be additional clarity when linking those units of analyses and those PICOs to specific conditions of use and chemical specific assessments, and linking within the integration chapter the output of integration to the risk evaluation in the protocol, and being more clear about specifically what is that output. For example, the hazard classification, an estimate of daily exposure, just being very clear about what exactly that output is, and potentially even giving example metrics to that where it's appropriate. I think that would help provide clarity as to what the data are being integrated for. That's it. Thank you.
Okay, any other committee members? Dr. Pelch.
Hi, this is Katie Pelch. I just wanted to thank everybody for the excellent summary and the building off comments from that. And then to further build off of Dr. Barrow's comments regarding the trusted sources, I just wanted to note that trusted sources is not in the glossary, but it is a term that is defined in multiple places in the document, specifically on page 83 and an appendix table K-1. So recommendation, if that term is to be used, is to add that to the glossary with that definition. And then I noticed that table 7-1 lists, the 4 types of FATE data as experimental data, field studies, modeling data, and monitoring data. But then on the very next page in figure 7.1, the field studies did not make it into that diagram, and I was not clear as to why. So I would just recommend checking to make sure that those 2 pieces of information, table 7-1 and figure 7-1, are made parallel.
Okay, thanks for that. Dr. Rooney.
Thank you. First, I'd like to support the comments from the previous associates, particularly Drs. Barrow, Wong, Wyckoff, and Pelch most recently. This is a challenging area, but they highlighted some very important concerns. One thing I'd like to add is recognizing that the approach to each discipline is necessarily distinct. However, the overall structure would really benefit from being more parallel and consistently presented. It's difficult to go from one to the other. For example, for PCAM, the approach seems to be clear and logical with a hierarchy of trusted data measured in estimated value. EPA refers then to high quality data as preferred, but it's not immediately clear on page 84 how the high quality data would be determined. Guidance to this point, similar to something in the following section for FATE, that figure being 7.2 is absent. Going on to FATE, there's more detail provided than for PCAM. And again, referencing 7.2 is helpful for a tier 2 data. However, the method to distinguish high quality studies for tier 1 is ambiguous and absent from the section. Going on to exposure, again, the details presented in greater detail. It seems to be each section has more detail. And table 7.0 or 7-7 is particularly useful. One thing to note here is there seems to be two figures called 7.3, and that either is a typo. One of them may be old, or they should be renumbered, A, B, something like that, editorial. And then moving on to the additional more complex issues of environmental hazard and human health hazard, they have similar challenges in the presentation that were noted previously, but they have greater complexity and greater strengths in the presentation. Overall, as a recommendation, EPA should spend some time to present a structure within each discipline that is more parallel in both the approach and in the concepts that are being covered. Understanding they're distinct, but a parallel approach and structure would really help get through the content. Thank you.
Okay, Dr. Apte.
Yeah, hi. Sorry, I'm on my phone and I'm going to shut my video off. I had sent some comments to Dr. Johnson, and he had sort of alluded to them in his summary, which was extensive. I wanted to specifically bring up the issue of extensive data on toxicogenomics on a lot of these chemicals. So both EPA internal intramural research, as well as a lot of other non-EPA scientists have been generating a lot of toxicogenomics data that are coming from gene arrays, RNA sequencing, and all sorts of what can be together called as next generation sequencing strategies. And I guess that those data probably fall under hazard and mechanism and human health effects. There is no real clear-cut, let's say, a way that EPA proposes how they will be using these data, because these data are so extensive and they require extra analysis or a further a little bit more analysis before they can be integrated into the standard risk assessment process. So I would like to see, my recommendation would be to have certain descriptions put in to the protocol, to the draft, where EPA can tell the public how they, whether first of all they like to use those data, and if they do, how they will like to use these data for the risk assessment.
Okay, thanks. Anybody else on the committee? Dr. Johnson?
Hey, just briefly, before you go to 4B, I just want to please remind my colleagues, if you could, your comments, if you provided after my summary, if you would please send them to me in writing, I'd appreciate it. Thank you.
Yeah, that's for any question. If you do have a comment on a particular question, please get your comments in to the lead for that, for sure. Okay. I'm not seeing any other committee members providing any input at this point. So let's go to the agency, to Dr. Barone. Any questions or clarification? You kind of got a lot there the last 42 minutes.
No, I think it was very helpful. The figures and tables, the structure, the examples will be helpful to us. The comment and the narrative that Dr. Johnson's challenged in integrating and putting together will, I think, help us. I think it's important to recognize this is the newest part of the protocol and really one of the hardest parts for us. As the committee appreciates, we are not just doing hazard, human health hazard, but all hazards. and exposure and the other disciplines that feed into the exposure and the hazard. So the committee's comments are I think, helpful. And the more references that are provided and examples provided along with those comments, the more constructive this can be.
Yeah, definitely. Okay, let's go ahead and move on to 4B then. Dr. Fay, you want to read that into the record?
Are we on 4B? Yeah. Okay. Kelly Fay, US EPA, please comment on the clarity and transparency of the evidence integration approach and its inclusion of data obtained from, I think we did this one, right? Are we on C?
Actually, no. No, you read A.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah, so we're going to do B now.
Very similar.
Yes,
Please,
very similar.
Okay, starting over, Kelly Fay, US EPA, 4B, please comment on the clarity and transparency of the evidence integration approach and its inclusion of data obtained from systematic review and non-systematic review information, e.g. modeling and analog approaches included in the TSCA protocol for the PChem environmental fate, environmental release and engineering, exposure and or the hazard disciplines.
Perfect, thanks. Back at you, Dr. Johnson.
Alrighty. I think some of us recognize, you've heard this throughout, I think, our meeting, that objectively evaluating and ranking data from studies or other sources for purposes not what they were originally intended for is inherently difficult. You recognize that. On the hazard side, the only alternative to using an objective approach is a narrative one which can be criticized as not being necessarily objective. So ultimately, the EPA will need to weigh the advantages and disadvantages from this review and decide. Page 78, there are no review procedures for reviewing measured environmental concentrations of analytes. That is unacceptable. The closest approach to this is included in Table 6.7, which seeks modeled concentration data. This explains in part why previous SACC reviews have identified studies that include measured concentrations. The omitted monitoring data can contradict exposure modeling data and increase exposure estimates for risk determination. Page 108, Table 711, this table is very comprehensive, logical, and useful. I urge caution on providing an a priori value on the use of species sensitivity distribution. Some can be quite misleading because of variability that's associated with the methods, not necessarily the sensitivity of the species. Page 111, section 7511, general considerations, suggest including in vitro and read-across as evidence streams. I think you've heard this before. Information may require qualitative assessment to determine relevance. Some QSARs provide quantitative levels of confidence given representativeness in the database of similar structures. It must be also noted that all QSARs are not the same or equivalent. And the last comment I have is more description is needed for manual read-across. And that's all I have. I'll stop there.
Okay, that's a little quicker than the last one, I guess. Dr. Heiger-Bernays.
I don't have any additional comments. Thank you, Dr. Johnson.
And Dr. Barrow?
No, nothing additional. My points were covered actually under the last question relevant to this. Thank you.
Yeah, they were very similar, it seems. Dr. Goyak?
No, nothing additional now. Thank you.
Okay. Dr. Wong?
No addition. Thank you.
And Dr. Wyckoff?
Yes, thank you. Just a short comment emphasizing the potential for improvement in clarity in the workflow. I think that Dr. Johnson mentioned this, but just emphasizing better describing, again, the workflow between the steps, so kind of between the chapters, and deciding based on the information you have, when you use alternative methods or modeling, et cetera, and then how does that come back in? So again, diagrams or just descriptions on how that workflow and the decisions for that would be helpful.
Okay. Other committee members? Sounds like folks want to, oh, there you go, Dr. Goyak.
I was giving other committee members a chance since I missed my turn.
Oh, no worries.
I would like to emphasize what Dr. Wyckoff just said. I think that's really important. It's a little unclear in terms of how you to go between the different steps in the protocol, particularly when at what step is the decision made to generate more read across or implement modeling, identify modeling data. It's just I think some more guidance is needed in how you make those decisions for moving to step by step. And I like the idea of as Dr. Wyckoff mentioned, maybe a figure with the workflow, or kind of showing where there might be iterations in the step if you in between the steps of the decisions.
Okay, thank you. Anyone else? So I'm thinking about a food break at this point, if that's minimal to everyone. We're sort of 10 minutes before noon on the East Coast time. So if that's okay, let's go ahead and let's return at 35 past the hour for our food break, and we'll finish off question 4 at that point. Okay? We'll see you in 45. Okay, welcome back, everybody. I'm about to resume. We neglected to give Dr. Barone a chance to respond to 4B, which we'll do after the roll call. We'll do the roll call first. So Dr. Apte?
Present.
Dr. Baker?
Here.
Dr. Blystone?
Here.
Dr. Cobb is away. Dr. Chason? Dr. Chason? Okay. Dr. Davies?
I'm here.
Dr. Doucette?
Here.
Dr. Heiger-Bernays?
Here.
Ooh. It's a big one. Dr. Johnson?
Here.
Dr. Kissel? Dr. Kissel? Okay. Dr. Prisbilla?
Present.
Dr. Reif? Dr. Reif? Okay. Dr. Rollins? Dr. Rollins? Dr. Voorhees?
I'm here.
Dr. Barrow?
Here.
Dr. Pulin Fidenik?
Here, present. Good job.
Got it. Yay. Only took me all 3 days, right? Dr. Goyak?
I'm here.
Dr. Lamb?
Here.
Dr. Myers? Dr. Myers? Okay. Dr. Pelch?
Here.
Dr. Rooney?
Here.
Dr. Wong?
Here.
Dr. Wyckoff?
Here.
Okay. Dr. Chason?
Dr. Schlenk. Dr. Schlenk,
Yes.
this is Craig Rollins. I'm sorry, I had double mute, so I am here. So.
Oh, no worries. Dr. Chason?
Here.
Okay. And Dr. Kissel?
Here.
Gotcha. Dr. Reif? Dr. Reif? Okay, I guess he's out somewhere as well. Okay. We've got enough for a quorum, so we can go forward. We just finished up with 4B, and at this point, let's go ahead and go back to Dr. Barone. Do you have any questions regarding the comments of 4B? You've had a chance to stew on them a bit, so.
No, Dr. Schlenk, not at this time.
Okay, thanks. All right, so let's go ahead and move forward with 4C. And Dr. Fay, if you can read that into the record.
Kelly Fay, EPA, charge question 4C. Please comment on the clarity of the evaluation of the strength of the evidence and overall weight of the scientific evidence as components of evidence integration for each discipline.
Okay, and our lead discussant for that is Dr. Hager-Bernays.
Yes, I was muted. Okay. Thank you. There were extensive comments and recommendations with regard to the definition of and the clarity of weight of scientific evidence with regard to evidence integration. One committee members point out that the tables that include considerations that increase or decrease strength of evidence within each evidence stream and with criteria describing the overall judgment call are extremely helpful and will be useful to drive consistency, but are currently confusing. Multiple committee members point out that even after reading the chapter several times and hearing the presentations from EPA staff on day one, they still do not have a clear understanding of the difference of strength of evidence and overall weight of the evidence. It seems these are described differently across the disciplines and are made more complicated in the protocol than may actually be necessary. In addition, multiple committee members point out that the integration process needs to improve the clarity and where the integration of data streams occur, as noted in 4A. Several committee members point out that in the protocol, the terminology of integration is muddled or conflated with weight of evidence. For example, figure 7.4 is entitled Process for Weight of the Scientific Evidence Integration. The unit of analysis for evidence integration and weight of scientific evidence synthesis are not clearly defined. It's recognized that although TSCA uses the term weight of evidence, as in page 28 in the protocol, it is still not clear what this means. It seems that EPA believes that integrating systematic review methods into the TSCA risk evaluations is critical to meet the scientific standards as described in TSCA. The TSCA protocol continues to define weight of scientific evidence, see page 83, as a systematic review process, which it is not. Figure 3-1 defines weight of the scientific evidence as considers the results of the systematic review method and additional evidence from non-systematic review methods. This is inconsistent with other uses of the term in the protocol. The 2014 NAS review of the IRIS process stated that the committee views weight of evidence analysis as a judgment-based process for evaluating strengths of evidence to infer causation. However, it found that the phrase as used in practice has become too vague and is of little scientific use. An IRIS assessment must come to a judgment about whether a chemical is hazardous to human health and must do so by integrating a variety of lines of evidence. Therefore, the NAS committee found the term evidence integration to be more useful and more descriptive of the process that occurs after completion of systematic reviews. Multiple committee members question the clarity in the use of the term strength of the evidence. In the protocol, this term is sometimes associated with approaches that rely on a few studies with strong associations between exposure and outcome. Strength is sometimes used to describe magnitude of effects. There is some inconsistency between strength of the evidence and confidence, where the overall weight of scientific evidence judgment call is described in the text as confidence descriptors. In other words, robust, moderate, slight, or indeterminate. See section 7.33. Well, the tables in the glossary describe this judgment call as the strength of the evidence. For example, table 7.6. A proposed recommendation might be to clarify the terms and concepts to indicate that the weight of the scientific evidence is not the systematic review process, and to use the recommendations of the national academies and to recognize the hazard exposure conclusion based on the review of the data, and that the strength of evidence is certainty or confidence in that conclusion, if this is an accurate interpretation of what is written, where confidence may be a clearer way to categorically describe the overall judgment call for the weight of the scientific evidence, consistent with the current use of the term. See OHAT framework, Rooney et al. 2014, EFSA 2017, and section 7.33 of this document. The strength of evidence categories for human health evidence in section 7.5.2.1 are confusing. The terms robust, moderate, slight, indeterminate are agnostic to the conclusion type, effect, no effect. But the last category, compelling evidence of no effect, seems to combine strength and weight of scientific evidence. Further, these categories do not seem to be consistent with other disciplines. The human health examples on page 119 seem to confuse the matter more than provide clarity. In these examples, it seems the objective is to clarify the strength of evidence, but the text seems to be conflated with weight of scientific evidence concepts. Further, there is information on increasing and decreasing strength, but increasing or decreasing from what? Is there a starting level of strength? Further, these examples would be more helpful if each bullet was connected to the consideration terms from table 7-13, quality, consistency, magnitude, etc. In each discipline, there are factors that increase or decrease strength, but it is not clear what they are increasing or decreasing from. For example, is there a starting point? Consistent descriptors are not used for rating the output of the evidence integration. For example, for exposure assessments on page 97 and hazard on page 107, the judgment is summarized using confidence descriptors, robust, slight, or indeterminate. And tables 7.7 and 7.11 provides a rough rubric for each of these descriptors. Environmental fate data appear to be integrated narratively with a discussion of the strengths and limitation of the data sources, as well as characterization of their uncertainties and variabilities. There is no justification for these two very different approaches to integration. On page 92, figure 7-3, pests are not specifically called out, only weight of scientific evidence for occupational, general population, consumer, and environmental exposure. And there may be other similar examples in the text. There is a recommendation that EPA include a figure or table that shows the flow of the PICO data within a data stream and then how those data streams are integrated. The integration needs to provide the overall body of the evidence. Table 7-4, hierarchy guiding integration of occupational exposure data and information. There seems to be a lack of clarity in this table, divergent responses amongst committee members, and committee members identify that it is unclear how occupational exposures are assessed in context of PPE and industrial hygiene concepts. It is pointed out that there's information in the EPA exposure factors handbook for environmental exposures, but no corollary description of occupational exposure issues. Multiple committee members remind EPA that the assumption of use of PPE at all times is not at all realistic and unacceptable for evaluation purposes, while other committee members point out that if personnel personal monitoring data are examined or included, EPA should take into account standard PPE worn during those monitored tasks. If PPE is a standard condition of use, there can be no assumption that workers will be exposed to the amount measured in the study. This is particularly critical where there are limited known facilities where exposures could occur. In addition, measured concentrations are given preference over modeled concentrations, with the highest preference given to monitoring data that are both chemical specific and directly representative of the conditions under which exposure is known or assumed to occur for each situation. And this point was discussed further in question 4A. Moving to the question of evidence judgments within evidence streams and associated descriptors on page 116, where the bullet points might be misread as 5 choices of evidence of no effect, with recommendations that the list might be changed to robust, moderate, slight, or indeterminate evidence of causal effect, or compelling evidence of no effect. Table 7-3, considerations that inform evaluations of the strength of the evidence within an evidence stream, in other words, human, animal, or mechanistic. Committee members state that there's a need to define the term evidence integration narrative. In addition, there is lack of clarity around the timing for release of the evidence integration narratives. Specifically, will they only be available when the draft risk evaluation is released, or will EPA decisions and judgments on strength of the evidence and weight of scientific evidence be available as work in progress for input by stakeholders? Several committee members provided specific recommended modifications to table 713 and to table 714, classification for weight of the evidence, and other members raised the same issues. These recommendations to the tables have been shared. The recommendations to revise tables were shared previously for the record by Dr. Wong, who provides recommendations to improve the interpretation and clarity of the descriptors used to describe the evidence judgments within the evidence streams presented in these tables. A few more specifics, though, is that on page 117, the key is biological significance, which is stated, but some biological insignificant changes might be large in magnitude. Page 118, the last line, without evidence or without compelling evidence. And page 120 uses the term non-case studies, which need to be defined. Page 120, the stepwise approach is not clearly stated. Page 120 and the last 4 lines need to be clarified. Right now, there is insufficient clarity as to whether the level of evidence of lacking human effects are either robust or inadequate. Table 714, several committee members noted that there is currently no requirement for specific mechanistic information. However, the recommendation by several committee members is that there should be at least moderate evidence of biological plausibility that the outcome seen in animals could occur in humans, example via shared key events or pathways. There were some additional suggested edits. Page 116, second paragraph. All analysis depends on available suitable data. If studies are sparse or varied, by varied, unless this is not the meaning. Page 116 needs lines 7 and 8 needs clarification. Does EPA mean factors that increase or decrease the strength of the evidence are summarized in an evidence profile table to consistently and transparently document rationales of each decision throughout the evidence integration process? Page 120, the last paragraph, under the necessary conditions of exposure should be omitted because the sentence already has chemical exposure. Page 566, table appendix P7, there are serious flaws that make environmental hazard studies uninformative. More than test substance identity and purity is important. Analytical confirmation is needed to include homogeneity and stability is needed to assess results. With regard to data quality, in Appendix O, the EPA included information that, if utilized, would be excellent. However, the agency has generally failed to follow modeling guidance in several ways. One bullet point in Appendix O states that a goal of modeling is to determine how closely does the model approximate the real system of interest. When there are no data from the system of interest, then there is no way to determine if the model is predicting that system's behavior. And two, an NRC report 2007 is cited for developing this review approach. Specifically, that report states often, however, data are missing, which is an inherent factor in the need for models. Optimally, measurements and models develop iteratively, each informing the other. The agency must employ this strategy to determine when additional data are needed. It is folly to assume that little or no data will lead to assessments that protect human or environmental health, and included is the citation for the national academies. And that is what I have for question 4C, sorry.
They all get mixed together, don't they? Yeah, our first associate discussing is Dr. Blystone.
Yeah, no, that was great. I have nothing to add.
Dr. Barrow?
Great summary, nothing to add.
Dr. Goyak?
I agree. That was a great summary. You covered my comments, nothing else. Thanks.
Dr. Wong?
Same here, nothing to add. Thank you.
And Dr. Wyckoff?
Well, at the risk of sounding silly, pun intended, that was a great integration of all of the comments, truly. Thank you. Nothing to add.
Well, I think that was the first one. We had all four. Okay. Out to Dr. Johnson. You've got your hand up.
Yeah, thank you, Wendy. Excellent job. And I'm envious. I wish I could have cleared all the bases like you did. I think what I'm listening to and I'm hearing across all these different charge questions basically are two themes, right? You know, are the data reliable, right? That's a quality question. And then are the data useful? And I think the PICO statement goes a long way to addressing the latter. But I think it comes back again because after you've done your PICO, after you do that, you ask the reliability question, right? The quality question. And then a lot of us are saying that, you know, maybe the data didn't reach your quality threshold, but it's still kind of useful. It may be useful in a corroboration sense. It may be useful in other ways you probably haven't considered. So I just wanted to enter that in for the record. Maybe I can come up with a flow chart where this thought kind of makes a little bit more sense. Thank you.
Yeah, also a recommendation would be really good in terms of how to do what you just described, Mark. That'd be great. Dr. Chasen?
Thank you. As typical, Wendy, great job on the integration. I wanted to comment on Mark's, Dr. Johnson's comment. I too share your attitude about this, that now I'm looking specifically at the exposure. These comments are particularly useful for the exposure and then integration into a risk assessment phase of doing something. I didn't find in general the process of taking the big body of things that go into doing an exposure assessment to be that the process that's described here, and might work very nicely for hazard assessment and physical chemical properties and other things like that, that's fine. But for looking at the kind of data that make the puzzle pieces, to go back to Dr. Wong's metaphoric allusion, which I thought was terrific, that's how you build an exposure assessment. So I like Dr. Johnson's concept of whether any one of these pieces is useful. As an individual piece, like Dr. Wang says, it might be a little, cloudy, a little worn maybe, but it brings a really important element one way or another to the overall picture that you have to build. Now, if you don't have that piece of information, you might increase the possibility of not being able to actually make a quantitative decision. Maybe you have enough information to make the assumption that humans are exposed or that particular categories of people are exposed, but you not have enough information to quantify it. And that leads to maybe some, and this was vague to me too, how do you decide what the pertinent data gaps would be, and looking across that sort of puzzle. And so, Dr. Johnson, when you're doing your, if you're going to take on the task of trying to make an example flow chart, I would be more than happy to try to do a parallel one that explains this for the exposure assessment, if you would like. So anyhow, I like these analogies and these concepts of whether data are useful without going through the anguish of, for the exposure assessment, at least of these kinds of steps. Thank you.
Dr. Johnson responded with a thumbs up. Dr. Rooney.
Would also like to commend the summary. It was fantastic, but I want to support some individual comments on it and point out a few things. Well, the information in this chapter is the longest piece. It's over 40, well, depending on appendix and how you count things, it's over 45 pages in the main text. It suffers from an overall lack of organization. And we respect the challenges and the process given the breadth of information and therefore the complexity of the process. That said, it's particularly important that figure 7.4 and other parts present a general overall clarity to the individual steps and how they come together in the evidence integration. So I want to support the committee and the comments that have already been presented from multiple members about the need for clarification across the chapter, particularly with the use of strength of evidence within the evidence streams, how the evidence streams are integrated, how and when the evidence is transformed from strength of evidence to weight of evidence, and caution on the use of those terms, improvements to table 714, 715, the need for a clear connection to PICO to guide the integration, the need for clear evidence profile tables, and apologize for that repetition. I just wanted to indicate there was more committee members that support those points. And then finally, I think if EPA could step back, there is a need for a clear stepwise process. EPA should be able to show, and the readers should be able to follow step 1, then step 2, then step 3. Similarly, it should be clear if a decision is reached at step 1, then it leads to a particular path at step 2. And that's currently not possible with the structure. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Rooney, and thanks for the recommendations. I think those will be very useful.
And this is Wendy Hager-Bernays. Dr. Rooney, you'll share those, please.
I hope so. He's got a thumbs up, so. Any other committee members? Okay, let's go to the agency. Dr. Barone, any questions of clarification?
Not at this time. I think the committee is struggling with what we struggled with, and I appreciate, we appreciate, the stepping back and looking at the bigger picture, and your suggestions about making this more linear. And we struggle with that. We also struggle with where the iterations occur. So any comments on appropriate iterative steps would also be helpful.
Sounds doable. Dr. Barrow.
Yeah, I just wonder if could I ask a question of EPA at this point, because we all are struggling with this, and my question is actually pretty simple, and it's probably easily answered.
Sure. Yeah, we haven't stopped so far, so.
Okay. So I know the term weight of scientific evidence is used in the regulation, and TSCA is required to use that term. But part of the struggle that the entire committee is having is how these terms relate with weight of evidence and evidence integration. And is it possible for EPA to just say that, weight of scientific evidence is an outmoded term now, and we're redefining it as strength of evidence, for example, and then that would help with this linear process. We've got evidence synthesis, or whatever you want to call it, within streams, and then we've got evidence integration across streams. And it just seems like, eliminating some of the confusing terminology would help if that's possible.
So it's a
So
short
is that
answer.
a question to Dr. Brown? Yes. Okay, go ahead.
Yeah, I think I understand the question in there. The short answer is no, we cannot just drop weight of the scientific evidence because it's statutorily required and it's part of the risk evaluation rule. Your suggestions and feedback about the streamlined process or the stepwise pattern or process, and what terms we could or should use can help define what we mean, at least in the systematic review protocol and in a potential handbook, what we are defining as weight of the scientific evidence. The current rule says that systematic review, risk evaluation rule says that systematic review is an approach to support the weight of the scientific evidence. So we cannot just disregard that term, if that's your suggestion.
Sorry, but you could redefine it, or you could.
That's Lisa Barrow.
Yeah, sorry, this is Lisa Barrow. I'm sorry, my buttons are going crazy. But it would be, yes, that was my suggestion, to not stop using that term. But if you can't, can you redefine it? Because right now it's defined as it is in the statute, and I think that's causing a lot of confusion because it's not a systematic review method. So that's the question. Can it be redefined or defined in another way?
We can, through the development of the systematic review protocol, augment what goes into that definition. What is considered under a systematic review approach.
So it sounds like a recommendation of how to augment that definition would be very useful. Am I right? I guess. Crickets. Dr. Johnson.
Yeah, I would just caution that because I think maybe Dr. Barron's aware that the Department of Defense tried something similar to develop a systematic review process that wasn't the OHAT procedure. And the National Academy pretty much said, no, you can't do that. There's only one systematic review procedure, and this is it. So, I mean, you could try it, but I guess if you want to get back to the National Academies, they may have an issue with it.
Okay, thanks for the word of warning, Dr. Johnson. Okay, with that discussion complete, let's go ahead and move forward to question 4D. So Dr. Fay, if you can read that in.
Kelly Fay, US EPA, on charge question 4D. Please comment on the clarity and practicability of the definition and application of the term integration for each of the scientific disciplines in TSCA risk evaluations. Does the use of this term and its broad definition provide flexibility for the fit for purpose and discipline-specific approach that is unique to TSCA risk evaluations?
And our lead discussant is Dr. Heiger-Bernay again.
Yes, Dr. Wendy Heiger-Bernays. The protocol and this question refer to fit for purpose. While the fit for purpose term is commonly used, it needs to be defined in the context of this protocol, and the term needs to be in the glossary of select terms. Okay, now let's get into this. Several committee members note that the wording of Chapter 7 starts, following scoping, EPA initiates the initial phase of the risk evaluation, which begins, emphasis added, with integration. The suggestion that integration is the beginning of the analysis phase seems inconsistent with earlier chapters. It is also inconsistent with the opening phrase in 7.2.2, after systematic review activities conclude. Again, confusion about the integration and what it looks like. As outlined in question 4B and 4C, evidence integration should not be conflated with systematic review, making it important to clarify the definition and application of the term integration. With regard to the use of the term integration, we have multiple perspectives. A committee member states that the use of the term integration is appropriate in that the systematic review process is considering different evidence streams per discipline and providing a framework to use the totality of the evidence to inform the risk evaluation. Other committee members state that integration is an acceptable term for all of the disciplines under the condition that the output of integration is clearly defined for each discipline, but points out that the output is not currently clearly defined for the disciplines. It is critical that for each discipline, there is a clear statement of the output of integration in context of the risk evaluation. This should be as specific as possible. For example, a daily estimate of environmental exposure in milligrams per kilogram per day, or similar metric, a classification of hazard potential for each endpoint, etc. For example, table 7-2 would be more useful if the last column, exposure assessment component, quotes, included example metrics and was clearly identified as the output of the integration step. Multiple committee members stated that the terminology of integration is muddled with the weight of evidence. This comment was reiterated from the prior question, which was 4C, in that the unit of analysis for evidence integration and weight of evidence, weight of the scientific evidence are not clearly defined. That is all we have for 4D.
Okay, thank you. Mark, your hand's up. I don't know if it is meant to be up, but
Sorry about that. I'll take it down.
no worries. No worries. Our first associate's Dr. Blystone,
Yeah, hi, nothing to add.
Dr. Barrow,
Nope, nothing to add.
Dr. Goyak,
Nothing to add.
Dr. Wong,
Nothing to add.
and Dr. Wyckoff. Dr.
Nothing to
Wyckoff.
add. I'm sorry, nothing to add. Thank you.
Wow, when you're 2 for 2, that's impressive.
It's 3 days and people are tired.
I think you're right. Any other committee members? Anyone else? Yeah, I think we're burning it out here. Anyone else? Okay, let's go back to Dr. Barone. Any questions or clarification on 4D?
No, thank you for Wendy's synthesis and integration.
Yeah, great job. All right. I know there's a break penciled in here, but I think we're actually ahead of time. So let's go ahead and knock this one out if everyone's okay with that. Let's see if we can go 3 for 3, Wendy. First, let's, sorry, Dr. Fay, you want to read that into the record?
Kelly Fay, EPA, charge question 4E. Please comment on any other aspect of the evidence integration for the scientific disciplines. PChem, environmental fate, environmental releases exposure, including engineering/occupational and hazard, ecological and human health evidence that would be beneficial for EPA to consider when conducting evidence integration to support TSCA risk evaluations.
Okay,
Dr.
here goes.
Hager-Bernays.
Yes, Wendy Hager-Bernays. I will say that there are comments in here that seem to have been sent my way because this is the last question. So I'll
Yes.
keep reading. Okay, given that subsequent steps of the risk evaluation are dependent on the systematic review, but are not quote unquote included in the systematic review steps, it is recommended that as part of integration, additional information is provided to help transition to key risk evaluation decisions, such as critical effects, points of departure, et cetera. That is to better explain how the synthesis and integration of information for each discipline can contribute to the overall integration and to subsequent risk evaluation decisions. It is most pragmatic, it seems, to conduct a synthesis of the integrated data to characterize the most sensitive effects, potential candidate studies, et cetera, based on the integration step. Multiple committee members raised concern about the concepts of uncertainty and variability. Throughout Chapter 7, these concepts are mentioned, but are not well described and are also perhaps not described in a manner which is consistent with the definitions in the glossary. As uncertainty and variability are critical aspects of risk assessment, the protocol should more clearly describe for each discipline exactly what should be characterized as part of such. Example, ranges of data, conclusions, or actual variability in the exposure considerations with regard to pests and occupational exposures. The evidence integration chapter concludes with section 7.5.2.4, characterization of strength, limitations, assumptions, and key sources of uncertainty in the human health hazard assessments. Any risk assessment document should, of course, characterize strengths, limitations, assumptions, and uncertainties to provide context to its conclusions and results. In this case, however, this section seems to have been drafted without reference to the rest of the evidence integration chapter. It highlights issues such as consistency of evidence and relevance of animal evidence to humans that are integral to the evidence integration process that has already been outlined, and the important points have been covered in section 7.5.2.3, overall weight of the scientific evidence judgments. In addition, some of the text of this chapter is most relevant to characterizing the results of dose response assessment or risk characterization, which are not subjects of this protocol. Committee members refer to EPA to explicit consideration of uncertainty and variability as recommended by the National Academies in their Science and Decisions document. It is not clear how or when integration is done or how it relates to critical risk evaluation concepts such as mode of action, toxicokinetics, pests, etc. Section 7.5.1.3 indicates mechanistic evidence is integrated on its own, but the protocol is unclear. Is the mechanistic evidence used to assess plausibility or a pathway or something else, unless there are data which are diagnostic of an effect? This section also discusses events associated with a phenotypic event, but it is not clear how this known as in most cases, it is not part of the investigation. Section 7.1, page 84, mentions high, medium studies. Are there gradations between high, medium, low, and uninformative? By linking to definitions, this can be clarified. It is unclear why the data screening step would be where decisions are made regarding review of mechanistic evidence as raised previously, and no further explanation is provided. Multiple reviewers recommend that the protocol should be revised to incorporate an explicit step that indicates how assessment teams are to determine what mechanistic evidence to review and how that evidence is selected from the larger body of studies tagged as supplemental or mechanistic. Both Bradford Hill and Grading of Recommendations, Assessment, Development, and Evaluation, or GRADE, are cited in this chapter. It was not clear which or if both are relied upon. The human health section is where GRADE is cited. These two approaches are not the same. One aims at determining causality, the Bradford Hill, and the other certainty in the evidence, or GRADE. Very importantly, GRADE does not explicitly consider biological plausibility, an aspect which is critical in the risk evaluation process. There is some inconsistency on how to incorporate physical chemical properties data as a discipline, see table 3-1, or as an evidence stream within exposure assessment, see section 7.3.2. For exposure, the approach to defining evidence streams for exposure sciences might benefit from additional consideration, as different approaches are used to define subcategories of data. Section 7.3.2 identifies the disciplines to be integrated in an exposure assessment. Figure 7-3, example integration of exposure data, defines subcategories as modeled, monitored, experimental, and table 7-7, criteria to guide weight of scientific evidence judgment calls, defines similar but distinct subcategories: exposure scenario factors, measured monitored data, estimation, methodology data. There is no guidance or template for the overall evidence integration judgment call for exposure assessment, similar to the ones provided for environmental hazard, table 7-12, and human health hazard, table 7-14. And EPA should provide for transparency of how this is done. Several questions and comments about the language and clarity of specific aspects of Chapter 7 are identified by committee members. I'll read them for the record, and when we draft the report, we'll consolidate them into relevant and actionable tables and in a clearly presented way. Clarify if table 7-1 is also meant to be a hierarchy. Clarify or define what physical chemical endpoints are and if they can have a range, or if there are point estimates versus selected determined from the integration. Terms are inconsistently used and need to be defined. Data streams, evidence streams, categories, tiers, evidence analysis, consideration, bodies of evidence. Figure 7-1, why are field studies not included in the figure, but are included in table 7-1? What are the FATE endpoints? There did not seem to be information related to likelihood of persistence and bioconcentration in the environment from each FATE endpoint. Page 87, during evidence integration, a determination of confidence in the range of FATE endpoints are made based on the study quality of contribute data points. It is not clear if this is a strength of evidence or weight of scientific evidence or neither. It seems to be different yet important to the risk evaluation. Figure 7-1 indicates the last step is weight of scientific evidence, but the apparent endpoints, FATE information, media specific, and overall FATE narratives, persistence and bioaccumulation potential come prior. This is confusing because it seems there are the outputs of the weight of evidence of scientific evidence and should be part of or after this. Figure 7-1 does not show integration of data that may come outside of the systematic review. Figure 7-2 confirm that the legend is accurate. It does not seem so. Figure 7-2 is confusing because it seems different concepts are conveyed between tier 1 and tier 2. It is unclear what exactly comes out of tier 1. Good use of reference to relevant chemical exposures in assessing and integrating data. 7.3.1 is a good section, but seems out of place or perhaps just needs to be better connected as to why it is important to developing the output for the risk evaluation based on information from the systematic review. Figure 7-3 does not seem to match terms and concepts from table 7-2. Figure 7-3 need to clarify whether the weight of the scientific evidence is presented by conditions of use. Table 7-3 includes modeling approaches which don't appear to be different in 7-3. Table 7-4, are TLVs and RELs, et cetera, really voluntary? And why are OELs less preferred if they are from another agency with expertise in occupational exposure assessment? Page 96 refers to central tendency and high end. These are important risk evaluation concepts and should be addressed in every relevant discipline. Table 7-8, EPA needs to confirm the accuracy of the table title raised before. In previous questions, how are apical endpoints defined, and to caution on only relying on apical endpoints if they are interpreted as organ system effects. How are mechanistic data defined? Mechanistic does not equal in vitro. Table 7.4.2.2 mechanistic studies. It is not clear what really should be done here. Should these be interpreted based on a biological construct or diagnostic to an apical event or mode of action? Unclear when data gaps are determined and or when or how read across or other methods are implemented. And finally, table 7-13, biological plausibility and relevance to humans are different yet potentially related concepts and should be separated. They're both important. That's all she wrote.
Okay. Dr. Barrow, your first associate.
Yeah, nothing. All my points were covered earlier. I do think in this catch-all question, it's a good place to reiterate the recommendation that we made earlier about EPA having a figure and accompanying text to explain the linear process, which could have loopbacks, of course, but to explain how EPA goes from scoping to the targeted questions, and within these targeted questions, which studies go through to study evaluation and synthesis or systematic review, and then how the data from these different questions are integrated. Thank you.
Dr. Goyak.
No additional comments. Thank you.
Dr. Wang
No additional comment.
and Dr. Wyckoff.
No additional comments. Thank you.
Okay, other committee members. Last question here. Okay. All right. With that, I will go back to Dr. Barone. Any questions or clarification regarding the comments?
No, Dr. Schlenk, I think I actually thought it was really, the synthesis for this last question was more than I expected. And I think it was the good discussion and important addition to the dialogue.
Excellent. I agree with you. Okay. With that, I think it's what we customarily do here is go around the committee to ask whether or not you had other comments that weren't necessarily addressed by the questions. These will be added as an addendum to the minutes. Sometimes things come up that are pertinent that weren't necessarily addressed specifically by the agency. So with that, I will open the floor up to anybody that would like to provide additional comments.
I have a question. Oh, let me raise my hand. Okay, there we go.
Dr. Chasen.
I'm just curious, this might be helpful as we think about this, in terms of this concept of evergreen and how does Dr. Brown see the process or opportunity for using the final product here for SR, and then learning and then applying what you've learned and going back and making changes or, retooling any of it? Is there some concept for versions of this, like SR version 1 or SR version 2? How does that play into the agency's plans?
Dr. Brown?
Well, at this point, we've heard a lot of good suggestions, some of it diametrically opposed within the committee on some of the recommendations. We will have to digest the recommendations. We're going to have to look at our resources. We do intend to revise the protocol, and we'll be considering the recommendations of the committee. In addition, and I alluded to this previously, in our opening remarks, we're having conversations with our sister office, Office of Research and Development, on the revisions of the IRIS handbook, and we'll be coordinating with them as well, because they're in the process of responding to the NASM report to finalize the IRIS handbook. So we have two major activities on systematic review going on at the same time, recognizing that IRIS is human health hazard only. We're trying to align with that part of our program and to make it more seamless as an input for our human health systematic review pipeline. The question that Dr. Chason brought up, I think there were a number of important recommendations about the tools, about the workflows, about clarity. Those important recommendations some of which we've already considered, will be implemented and phased in over time. So we're looking at that. And again, remember, we have a timeline for these evaluations. We have to do the systematic review to support the statutory timelines for the risk evaluations. We can't stop and just publish papers and do validation exercises and do sidebar analysis. We're doing that, but we have to continue with the work. So I just put that as a contextual response, not a specific deadline that we can commit to.
Thank you, Dr. Barone. And I also just wanted to add my compliments to the agency. This is a heroic task that you've undertaken. And I do appreciate that the agency also provides the opportunity for a collection of people like this to make these recommendations. You're very gracious in the way you accept them. Thank you.
Okay. Given no further, Dr. Hager-Bernay.
I'm sorry, it's Wendy Hager-Bernays. I just have one question. We did not have any charge questions with regard to Chapter 6, right? So, well, since we're allowed to talk to Dr. Barone, I guess, what will happen with Chapter 6 as you move forward? Do we need to go back and do that at some point? Oh.
No, you have Chapter 6 was fair game with regard to the organization of the document under charge question 1. It was also fair game under question 4 because chapter 6 is really about the extraction process, extraction tables, how that's used in evidence integration. So if you have comments about Chapter 6, we really hope that you include those specific comments about the extraction narrative or any clarifications in your narrative and citations for suggestions or additional approaches that we might consider.
I believe
you.
Dr. Pelch, I think Dr. Pelch actually addressed that in question 1. So well, they'll be there, at least from what I heard a couple days ago anyway. All right, with no further comments or questions, I also would like to thank EPA for their patience in listening to, it's got to be challenging. It is challenging, I guess, to come up with something like this, as well as to listen to 20 some odd people hammer it mercilessly. But hopefully, again, a better approach will come out of that for sure. Also like to thank the contractors for organizing the meeting and the staff for putting the meeting together. I'd like to thank the public commenters for their input and time during the meeting. And I'd like to thank you, the members that spent so much time in putting this together. It was a Herculean task as well to kind of go through this document, and again, kudos to you in putting this together. Look forward to trying to assimilate it and get it out to the agency in our 90-day period. So with that, I will turn the meeting over to our DFO, Dr. Peterson.
This is Dr. Todd Peterson, and as DFO, I thank you to the SACC peer reviewers and the public for listening online. From what I'm hearing, we have had many members of the public listening, and I thank you all for your virtual attendance online. I want to make a special recognition of the OPP team for being online in an efficient and responsive way, for providing helpful clarifications and providing questions to the SACC peer reviewers. I wish to acknowledge the peer review and ethics branch staff. These are my teammates who all contribute to pre-meeting planning, support during the meeting this week, and post-meeting activities. That includes Joyce Coates, Barbara Ewell, Amal Ala Kamal, Dolores Lewis, and Charlene Matten. I wish to also recognize Steve Knott, who is both our branch chief and also the executive secretary, who oversees many of the functions related to the federal advisory committees that we support. And I further acknowledge the assistance provided by our EPA colleague, Bill Woogie. He's been very helpful in our planning and whatnot in our team, and to the Andina support contractor staff members, Kurd Ali and William King. Finally, I say over and over again, but to the peer reviewers deserve our continued thank yous for your work and robust deliberations and contributions that will lead to the recommendations and advice that the agency will look at, and that's how and that will help EPA's Toxic Substance Control Act draft systematic review protocol to be further refined. Again, the live stream video has been captured on YouTube for each day of these 3 days for the meeting, and the links to go back and review the meeting will be at the website that I've mentioned over and over again, which is www.EPA.gov/TSCA-PER-REVIEW. So that's www.epa.gov/TSCA peer review. One added note to the SACC peer reviewers, please stay online in this current Zoom session. As I announced the end of the public meeting, the YouTube session will close, and I will be asking all the persons on Zoom who are not a part of the peer review to leave. And then the peer reviewers, our PREB team, and the support contractors, please remain on Zoom for a brief post-meeting session for the benefit of our SACC peer reviewers. This concludes the peer review activities for today, and this concludes the SACC meeting for the peer review of EPA's TSCA Draft Systematic Review Protocol. This public session for the final day of the April SACC peer review meeting is now adjourned.